Hello, and welcome to this lovely conversation on queer spirituality. I am Dominic Longo, founder of Flourishing Gaze, and I am so delighted to bring together with me for this conversation two dear friends, Kathy Talvacchia and Bill Glenn. Thank you so much both for being here.
It's a pleasure.
My pleasure too.
Also, I want to note I'm introducing you to each other in this very conversation. Something about your lives and who you are in the world has, I guess, felt to me complementary and worthy of somehow putting together for this conversation. Besides being friends of mine whom I admire, you do have a number of other things in common. Well, you, like me, you both grew up Catholic. You've also done formal studies in theology and had leadership positions in academia. Kathy, you've been a dean at New York University, and Bill, you're currently the chair of the board of trustees at the Graduate Theological Union. You're also both partnered and have spouses. Two of my other favorite people. Yeah, in this conversation today, I want really to welcome all the parts of you, including ones that I have not named, things that you have in common and also things that are distinctive about you and your background. And yeah, as I mentioned, this topic, queer spirituality, I mean, being spiritual people and being members of the LGBTQ community is something that really all three of us share, and that I'm wanting to have us focus on through our personal sharing and exploring together. My hope is that from this conversation, those who watch it and us, the three of us, we can all maybe advance something about our own understanding of queer spirituality and what it can be to have a spiritual life for LGBTQ folks. Really, in a kind of open-ended way, maybe Kathy, if you're wanting, or Bill, to start, to just, is there anything that you would like to say to just kind of frame this conversation and to, yeah, as you come into it today, to help get us started?
I can start. So I guess for me, I would say that I approach spirituality and religion in general from a dual perspective of both, it's something that's personally a commitment of mine. I belong to faith community, have personal spiritual energies and life and practices that's very important to me, but is also something professionally that I do and have studied and have published in this area. So for me, part of what frames my conversation is those two energies that I bring to the work. And I try really hard to integrate those pieces together when I do my work. I do practical theology, which is an engagement of the practices of communities, in my case, in Christian traditions. And I'm always looking at both theories and practices and how they integrate together into how we live in the world. And I take that same energy into my, thinking about queer spirituality.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the fact, I guess, that all three of us have, we're not lay people in a certain sense, right? We're not casual practitioners of spirituality, but we do, all three of us here have academic training that, of course, changes how we pray, how we think, how we relate to religious community and tradition. And vice versa. We don't come to the study or to the formal parts of theology or religion, except as spiritual people too. And that-
I would frame mine in this way. A little bit of bio is a part of my frame. My first 10 years of my adult life, I spent as a Jesuit, and I'm deeply formed by the Jesuit sensibility and the Jesuit spirituality, which are still, I abide in deeply. Many years later, I left the Jesuits 40 years ago. I spent my professional life doing two things: a clinical psychology, private practice, and providing leadership in not-for-profits that were serving dispossessed people. And I came to understand, I'm a great pupil of Carl Jung's, that what is psychologically true needs to be spiritually true, and what's spiritually true needs to be psychologically true. And that's the way I approach my own internal spiritual life, which is of ultimate value to me. And it's also the way I do my work in the world, both as a clinician and as a nonprofit leader, keeping that tension or that nexus in mind, that the culture I live in is a psychologically astute culture, and it's increasingly a spiritually bereft culture, and try to find language to speak to the needs of human beings who I see are spiritually parched through no fault of their own, but through the movements in our culture that have ossified religion in so many ways and left people searching. It's part of why I'm at the GTU, which is a broadly interreligious place. Every world religion is in a conversation there, and it's engrossing for me and satisfying for me. So those are some of the ways I look at the questions that you posed, Dominic, and that you spoke to, Kathy.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for that, both of you. So this question is really about how your spiritual life supports you as a queer person, as a gay person, as a lesbian person. And I'd really invite you to look back over the course of your life, your coming out, your time perhaps in the closet, your dating, your falling in love, your all of your experience of community, gay community, queer community, professional, whatever. But really looking throughout your life experience, how does your spiritual life, or how has your spiritual life supported you as an LGBTQ person?
I'll speak to this, Dominic. My being gay and my being spiritual are really inseparable right now. And they're increasingly inseparable as I age. I'm 72. My spiritual journey began, as I suspect both of yours did, when I was kind of pre-literate. Catholicism has many graces to it, and one of them is the highly ritualized life of Catholicism, in which we're inculcated with ways of being in the world before we even have language to describe it. And in that sense, I am so appreciative of being a cultural Catholic. I was closeted until I was 30, and my closetedness caused me enormous pain. I drank around it. I was a deeply repressed person. But I came out of the closet in a course on social justice at the Jesuit School of Theology that changed my life, because the professor, the really beloved Bob Egan, required that we do social justice inside before we attempted to do social justice outside. And I found it a stunning concept, and it opened me up relatively quickly. And Harvey Milk, when I met him shortly before his assassination, did the rest. They pulled the tab out of my Roman collar and asked me to be a full human being. I couldn't have done that without the faith life that I had, I want to say, been given and inculcated over the course of my first 30 years. The first place I went as a out gay person was to Dignity, which is a Catholic organization, so that I could go to the Eucharist in comfort. And I was in Dignity for a while. The last time I went there, I was asked to preach. I preached the first Sunday of Advent on the Blessed Mother is an outlaw. And that homily did not find good reception among my peers at Dignity, who were they were looking for papal approval basically, and they weren't getting it. But I took my then new boyfriend, Scott, with me. That was our first date, so he could hear me preach. And 40 years later, he's saying, nothing has changed. Luckily for me, he was not raised Catholic, so there's no ritual tension in the house, but he's a person with a deep natural faith. My faith life and my identity, there's really no line between them. I wouldn't be the man I am or the out gay person I am without having the background and the depth of spirituality I was both given and happily received.
Yeah, I can relate to that in a lot of ways, Bill. So I am what you might call a pickled Catholic, in the sense that, you know, I think I counted, I have 18 years of Catholic schooling. I mean, from kindergarten on through my master's degree, and did my doctorate elsewhere, but lots and lots of Catholic background. And grew up in a family, you know, that was overtly religious and not excessively so, but, you know, it was comfortable in the home. It was a part of our lives. And growing up Catholic, you know, for me, I grew up with this sense of, you know, the sacraments and the embodiment and the presence of God in life, and also our responsibility as human beings to, you know, to respond to all that has been given us graciously, and to be about justice in the world. So that was a big part of my formation. I went to Jesuit college in Philadelphia, and was very influenced by the Jesuits at that time, who were getting into the whole, you know, focus of their order on faith and justice. So like you, Bill, I mean, I really connected into the whole notion of the importance of religion doing justice in the world. It was very much connected to what I believed about religious life and the energy of religious life anyway. And when I then I did my master's at Boston College, so more Jesuit life. And I really embraced feminist, I found a lot of feminism through feminist theology. I was reading a lot of feminist theology. So I had this whole background of this kind of formation in the Catholic tradition, Jesuit influence around faith and justice and progressive theology, feminist theology. And in all of that as well is my, you know, growing up with this sense of there's something a little bit different about me, and trying to understand what that was, and trying to make sense of the parts of me that were very spiritual and very religiously inclined, but also had a clear difference in how I engaged romantic life. And I wouldn't say that I was closeted in the sense that I just didn't know I just knew I was different. You know what I mean? It wasn't like I was trying to, like I knew and I was preventing. I was just kind of trying to figure out who I was and all these things. And there were other issues going on in my life that, you know, was sort of like the last thing on my mind. And after my master's, I was, you know, back in a Jesuit context, and I was working in a social justice office there at one of the Jesuit University. And in that process, I did the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And through that process, and just a process that just kind of brought all the pieces of my life together, I came out as a result of that process, which I think for some people that's shocking to think that you could come to that awareness through a very traditional practice of the Catholic Church. But I don't have to tell either of you, you're both well versed in Ignatian spirituality. And if it's about who you are before God, it's a natural conversation that's going to happen. So for me, I came to understand who I am through religion. And it was also an interesting part of the story also is, so in college, I did a degree in sociology and a minor in theology. And so I really learned pretty early on to look at the institution of church, right? Studying sociology helped me to understand the institution that I had been part of for a long time. And it gave me a certain understanding of the reality of institutions and what they do well and what they don't do well and what can be a problem and what can be very useful. And then adding to that, my own spiritual development. So for me, that all that combination, that sort of deep, deep spiritual experience of coming to an awareness of some sense of my authenticity as a queer person through the coming out process and through the exercises, mixed with a kind of an awareness of the institution of church, and also, having studied and seeing, seeing it more intellectually and understanding various parts of it, it helped me to kind of understand the way in which my spiritual life was both part of an institutional community, but also somehow could be something that lived perhaps in some separation from it, and at times in some resistance to it. So all of that kind of helped me become who I am in this way, this combination of the queer and the religious and the spiritual.
I kind of wish I would have known you back in the day. I think you're much younger than me, but it would have been good to consult on the aspect of the institution, which I couldn't get very clear on. And eventually, during the mid stages of the AIDS epidemic, I had an intuition that I needed to step out of the shadow of the church in order to become my full self. And that was 10 years after I had left the Jesuits.
Mm-hmm.
The institution weighed so much on my psyche. Being Irish Catholic is significantly different than being Italian Catholic. I have come to appreciate, knowing Dominic like I do. His freedoms, I don't know where they come from.
No, it is very different. It's true.
I'm both, for the record.
You're both, I know. Stepping out of the church for a long time, and I went back to seminary to get my MDiv when I was 50, but I didn't go back to the Jesuits. I went back to the Pacific School of Religion, which is the oldest Protestant seminary in the West, because I felt my work was to continue my vocation as a Jesuit outside the walls. Mm-hmm. But I would say in my adult life, the largest single pain is being in many ways outside the walls. I'm not totally outside the walls, and I would acknowledge Dominic's unbeknownst influence on my life, inviting me to be open. But the institution, I have a difficult time stepping inside of it because I can't get perspective on it. Mm-hmm. I want to make one other comment about the exercises. I so appreciate you've done the exercises. To me, they're a perfect example of what must be psychologically and spiritually true. They have to be in synergy. Yes. The exercises are such a wise psychological document. Ignatius was preternaturally hip to 20th century psychology in writing those exercises. He was so acutely aware of the sensitivities of the soul, the psyche, in creating that. And I love that the exercises help bring you out. That's a wonderful story.
It is. It really is. And I hadn't anticipated this direction, but clearly, Ignatian spirituality is so fundamental, really, to all three of us, beyond being Catholic and also sharing some ethnic backgrounds here as Americans of European descent. The word desire comes up, as I just think about the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola in the context of queer life. We, from Ignatius, put real valence on our desires as a place, a privileged place where the Spirit moves, where the divine is alive within us and through us. So the flip side of the first question was, okay, how has your spiritual life supported you as a queer person? Other way around now.
Mhm.
How has being gay or lesbian supported you as a spiritual person?
In a lot of ways, I have found it difficult to be at times comfortable in LGBTQ plus community and be openly religious, even though I am. I understand why there's deep resentment and resistance about that. I mean, I don't judge it in any way, because I totally understand where that comes from. And I feel it as well. For me, I have a different way into it and struggle with it. So on one level, I have not found a lot of the LGBTQ plus community engagements to be life-giving in that way in terms of the integration of myself. On the other hand, I know a lot of LGBTQ plus folks who are religiously inclined. And that has helped me a lot to kind of maintain a sense of how to continue working to put the pieces together. And, you know, Bill, you talked about being outside the wall. I think that's a particular suffering of folks who are religiously inclined and want to be connected to communities and don't want to not be who they are. So I think part of it is this outside the wall or walking along the edges or different kinds of imagery. But it is part of the struggle and the pain of that. However, one of the things that being able to live in the fullness of who I am has helped me spiritually is that the more that I can live authentically as possible, the more that I can live as a person who is, as you said, built together psychologically and spiritually, body, mind, spirit. If I can pull these pieces together, I am empowered in a way that lets me live fully, which can only help my spiritual life. So it's this interesting dance that happens, I think, when you're queer and connected to religion in some fashion, where what gives you life on either side is also what's banging against your life. It's sort of like, for me, what happens sometimes in families, right? It's sometimes there's this sense of in families, what gives you life is also part of what's you're struggling with in your life. So for me, a lot of my journey has been trying to figure out how to make these pieces cohere with some authenticity and to be comfortable with the push and the pull of it. Because I'm not the kind of person who naturally likes to live in that push and pull. It's not my natural temperament. But the fact is, that's where it is. And, when I was in college, I remember the whole, and then later in graduate school, There's a lot of conversation around Charles Curran and his work with the Vatican, and his understanding of his engagement of dissent as faithful dissent, and his theological rationale for his remaining faithful but dissenting and pushing back at things. And that influenced me a lot. So I think part of what LGBT life has helped me do is to have a place to live my fullest and to be with other people who live fully, which helps me then bring more resources to the world, to justice in the world, and to push back in the tradition in ways that say, I belong here too.
Your book is coming to mind as you're speaking, Embracing Disruptive Coherence, coming out as an erotic ethical practice. Do I have the subtitle right? Well, beautiful book, and as you know, it's been influential on me and some of the thinking that I've been doing about coming out. And as we talk about it here, what I'm noticing is that for us as queer people, in some ways, coming out, that resistance against the norm, that disrupting what I often call prefabricated molds, it's practice for being spiritual.
Mm.
It's practice for letting the divine in.
Mm-hmm.
Because the divine is always surprising, God of surprises, right? If the divine is the divine, it's beyond our understanding. And so it's going to come in ways that is, well, queer, against the grain. So that's part of what I'm hearing, Kathy, in what you're saying about how being a queer person has supported your spiritual development.
Mm-hmm.
I asked my father for Christmas 1 year early for Charles Curran's first book, and I think my father thought the world was going to end in our household if he allowed that book in the house. I love the question, how is being LGBTQ, for me, a gay man, influenced, and I would say supported my faith journey. I was raised with a template of Thomistic theology that occupied every possible cranny of my brain. It was the template for living a life, and it was dead. It was dead theology by the time I was asked to imbibe it. But I imbibed it, and I thought it was elegant, and it was pure, and I could apply it to anything, and I did, until I came out of the closet, until really my bursting out of the closet. And what the closet invited me to be, as you mentioned, Kathy, and you too, Dominic, was to be a human being, a full human being. And the act of breaking out, I love what you just said, Dominic, and how you said it, and I can't recapture it, but the bursting forth develops both a critical thinker and a person available for grace.
Yeah.
Thomism did not allow me to be available for grace. It told me where grace would be found if I applied it correctly. But coming out of the closet, my companion as I came out was the person of Jesus. And I was so taken up with that person and the freedom that came to me through that person. It steered me through my leaving the Jesuits and into my life. And has never not been the abiding source for me for freedom. It doesn't mean I'm utterly free, because I am not, but I'm a work in progress. But being gay gave me a critical perspective on life that requires that I be a seeker of justice. It requires it. It requires that I use that vision to look at all structures to see where they are dispossessing human beings of their humanity. And of course, the three of us know that's almost everywhere. So the work is endless, but it's a gift to be able to do it. I as a Thomist, I wouldn't have, who knows? But it's really a gift to be a gay man. I remember the first party I gave after I came out. We stood in a circle and prayed, as we've done for 40 years with our group of friends. And the only thing I could say was how grateful I am to be gay. And I think some of my older relatives who were there like, what kind of thinking is this? And I was thinking, it's the best thinking. It's the freest. It's the truest. It hasn't changed. I'm so grateful to be gay for that reason. That has nothing to do with my sexuality or my erotic life, which are very much a part of me, but it's a gift to be gay as a spiritual person. It's invited me to be a spiritual person.
I think that's part of the freedom, you know, that we're talking about, that authentic spirituality is somehow frees us to experience grace, to experience others, to experience community. And if religious communities want you to be that way, then religious communities can't penalize you for living that authenticity. And that contradiction is very hard to change in people's minds.
So I'd like to talk about religious trauma. This is a term I really myself didn't use or hear much until quite recently, really probably my work doing Flourishing Gays and really attending to the developmental journeys of LGBTQ people has necessarily had me attend to trauma. And Bill, I know you've told me before that in your training as a psychotherapist, the word trauma didn't come up, and it's a much more recent focus. I'm happy to hear any nuances that I'm missing as I recount that. But
you got it.
What I know, and this relates to Kathy, what you've already said about how being out as spiritual among our LGBTQ folks can be hard. Sometimes we want to be closeted as a spiritual person among the gays, among the lesbians, among the queer folks. And I understand that it is religious trauma that is at the heart of the resistance. It's like, well, you're gay, you can't be religious. No, that's for straight people. So many LGBTQ folks have experienced condemnation, formal shunning. I mean, I don't mean shunning in a metaphorical sense, but the shun, like excommunication from the community, right? Thrown out of the house as a teenager, the homeless youth. It's a travesty. But whether, even if this word religious trauma is rather new in our discourse, I wonder if there's anything in your own life experience that feels like it is something like that. It was some kind of estrangement or near traumatic or actually traumatic from religion of some kind.
For me, when I came out, because I came out the way I did through religious experience, I did not go through a period of time where I was struggling with, the tradition says I'm, this, but I really am, and it's a problem. When I came out, I had already studied theology. I'd studied feminism. I had the spiritual exercises. So I had a certain confidence about myself and that within religion. And I know that's not everyone's experience. That was mine. I also had already experienced very problematic engagements just on the level of being a woman. So dealing with the patriarchy. So dealing with, sexuality issues related to being queer was just, one more thing of dealing with patriarchal problems and religion, and how could you be a feminist and do religion? How could you be queer and do religion? So on the one hand, I felt like I had various tools to bring to my engagement with that struggle. On the other hand, the pain is real. And so there were times when I was very clear with myself that it was necessary for me to have moments where I was on the outskirts of things and needed some space, because you cannot put yourself into a situation of being pushed against unless you can handle it and you have other resources to bring it and you choose it. You don't want to stay in a relationship that is beating you down. You can only go if there's something in it that is life-giving and push and lets you push back against what is problematic. For me, I found life in the rituals and the practices. I found direction. I found God. So for me, it was worth that struggle, because I felt a certain, I don't know if you want to say calling, but a certain clarity that part of what my life was going to be about was somehow this witnessing of the fact that I can be both, and that these things live in some kind of harmony, at least in me, right? Not total, but I work towards that. At the same time, the period, Bill, that you're talking about in the, around AIDS and in the 80s, there was it was such a difficult time for any sexual non-normative person. It was so difficult. It was very hard. And so it was hard for me to completely engage. So as I said, I had this kind of dance of marginality. And there's, multiple centers. It's not like we go from the margin to back into the center. There's multiple centers, but there's a kind of marginality of engagement for self-protection. And, there are times when I've been more involved than less, and less involved than more, as when I needed to protect myself, or when I felt this is not life-giving. And then other moments when it feels life-giving, and I try to honor that. So I think for me, it's not been something that's either or. It's been both. The ways in which, and that's been sometimes, frankly, some of the pain of it, it's a lot easier, right? If you can say, well, this is just not working for me, and it's just harming me, and I leave and I go on to the next thing. But if it's also giving you life, it's a much more complicated discernment that has to happen. And so that's been part of my journey, is that. And also, in addition to being a dean at NYU, I was for many years on the faculty of Union Theological Seminary. And I met lots of students from all different kinds of religious traditions who were struggling. It wasn't just Catholicism, it was all kinds of traditions where people were struggling about issues of, gender and patriarchy and sexuality. And I was very involved in working with students on those issues. So I kind of had a large perspective to bring to this, my own personal work, plus my professional work of what I was engaging students and what I saw with them. And it was something that helped me. And then the various friends and colleagues who are openly queer and openly religious, and they're kind of talking with them in their struggle. So I guess I have a certain perspective on it, even though I have kind of had to do this dance.
I would expand your notion, Dominic, of trauma and LGBTQ people. I would say every LGBTQ person has been traumatized by living in this culture. Now, the levels of trauma vary, but it is impossible to grow up in this culture as it's impossible to grow up as a woman and not be traumatized in some way by the patriarchal structure that inhabits every facet of our lives, but I'll stick to LGBTQ people. I've developed a theory over the course of my life as a clinician. In 35 years of private practice, I saw many hundreds of individuals. The majority barely were LGBTQ people, mainly men, some women. I came to believe LGBTQ people are spiritually gifted, that there is something about the experience of being gay in the world that leads to a capacity for spiritual awareness, insight, gift, grace. And the deepest experience I had of my clients, and as a clinician, you grow to love your clients. They give themselves to you or in your presence in a profound and humbling way. The wounds they suffered at the hands of religion, family. I was raised in an Irish Catholic alcoholic household. Those three words are fused together. That's like one traumatic reality. Millions of young people are raised in households that are traumatizing on lots of levels. It's impossible for an LGBTQ kid to be in a household without having it be somewhat traumatic because the parents are referencing sexuality in very inappropriate, hurtful, and damaging ways from a very early age, and we take that in. So I think it's a reality of being LGBTQ that you suffer from trauma. So what? Well, positively, I think it tenderizes us to suffering and to empathy. Not at all times, but I think it opens us to deeper realms. Contrarily, it toughens us and makes us more afraid of those very sources that can provide succor and grace. Last week, Kathy and Dominic invited me to come to a Stations of the Cross virtual at St. Francis Xavier, and I had the real pleasure of going to St. Francis Xavier a little over a year ago with Dominic for Mass, which I seldom do. And this Stations of the Cross was all gay people. It was gay sponsored by the LGBTQ support group there. Is that correct, Dominic?
There were a lot. No, there were a couple. There was like environmental ministry and
that's right,
family faith, but there were
a lot of LGBT people there.
A lot of Yep.
And because it was virtual, we had 35 boxes of people's faces available to us in a way you don't in church. The beauty of watching these men and women tend to this very evocative Christian ritual of the Stations. Mm. I was done and we got offline. I did it offline. I do my crying offline. I wept. I was so grateful to be in this group of people. They're in New York, I'm in California, who knew? But nonetheless, it told me how deep my longing is for this connection that is very hard to get and sustain. I live in a rural county. The bishop here he's very close to the pre-council of Trent people. I think he would have been at Trent condemning Luther. He may have been there. He's an old guy, but that's how it is here. And it's not what I can do. So being there was like something so deep in me was nourished by a virtual Stations of the Cross. I want to say really, but really. And I know that was because of my longing and my exclusion from it, self-exclusion, is because I'm a gay person. So it's a two-edged sword for me, as you spoke of also.
And, Bill, just to sort of build on a couple of things you said, the way in which it's impossible not to be traumatized as LGBTQ people. When you add race in there, when you add gender issues, when you add class, able-bodiedness, any numbers of social inequalities, then it just creates that much more complexity and trauma to work your way through. Religious communities have the same problems, as we know, that exist outside. So there's racism in these communities. You know, at Xavier, my community as well. That's where I met Dominic. Actually, I met Dominic at St. Francis Xavier. You know, the community's doing a lot of work right now, trying to engage racial justice. And that's the kind of work that has to be done to create the kind of space for all people to feel included. So that's one thing, just made me think of when you were talking about this, you know, the intersectionality issues, right, of all the different pieces of who we are that have different experiences of privilege or oppression, right, in our society. And then the second thing I was thinking of when you were talking about that gay people have a special engagement with the holy, I guess you didn't say it that way, but that's kind of how I heard it. It made me think of Dominic, your question about who are the saints. And of course, I couldn't help but not think of John McNeill, right? The late John McNeill was a Jesuit who was really forced out of the Jesuits for being openly gay and pushing the church about, engaging LGBT life. And he had a certain belief about that as well. I think John McNeill is one of the real saints of the LGBTQ Catholic world. There are many, but he's certainly one of them. And he had this idea as well that there was something that LGBT people were called in a particular way with God to have a particular kind of engagement of the spirit. And I think a lot of that has to do with any community of folks who are, as you said so eloquently, Bill, dispossessed. I think, Christian gospel makes very clear that it is on the side of the dispossessed and that our work of justice belongs to that. And so for me, that's part of what fuels me. And at the same time, when things get rough, and they do, and statements are made, and like we heard this week from about blessing marriages and so forth. Part of pushing back is that engagement of with whom am I in community, and what are all the struggles we face that are dispossessing us, and how can we push back to get religious communities to connect with us in the way that we feel is right.
I will want to come back to the topic of queer saints, but before that, I want to pose this question to you, presuming, well, whoever watches this, but many will be LGBTQ folks, perhaps most of whom will no longer be part of religious communities. If they grew up in one, most seem to leave. What do those religious communities and congregations lose when the LGBTQ folks move on out?
I mean, part of how I would answer this is it's not just those of us who are queer who are moved on out. There's a lot of different religious traditions where exclusion happens for many different kinds of people.
Yes.
And the part of me that thinks, as an ethicist, is saying, well, every community has boundaries, right? In which we try to make clear who represents what we believe and who doesn't. And we say, this is not who we are, right? You had people saying that around, different racial justice things. This is not who we are. Well, unfortunately, with racial justice, it is who we are. Maybe the more accurate thing to say is it's not who we want to be. right? So then the question becomes, how can you create a conversation of inclusivity in which people who represent non-normative belief systems or ideas up against the community can present their difference in a sense of conviction and have that dialogue? And to me, that's part of what it's, and this is part of what I'm, thank you for bringing out my book earlier. This is part of what I'm saying in that book, is that part of living a coming out related to disruptive coherence is trying to create those conversations in communities that says, here's my difference, and this is why it's something I'm convicted about. And how can we as a community work towards greater inclusion? So I think the church, what does the church lose? Well, let me just not say church, any religious community, whether it's Jewish or Buddhist or whatever, or political LGBT communities. What do you lose? You lose people bringing their full selves, right? If you have to withhold part of who you are in order to function in those communities, you're not bringing your full strength to the work and the mission. How much more could be done if people were allowed to bring their full selves to it?
One of the ways I think of this is, I'll contrast it with a worshiping community in which there are no African Americans. There's a paucity of something that is felt immediately for me. If I'm in a community in which people of color are not a part, I don't know why, I may not know why, it doesn't matter why. There's something lacking emotionally for me.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things LGBTQ people bring into religious communities, and that they would be bereft of if we left, was, allow me to explain what I'm about to say, straight men would be left on an island. I think LGBTQ people tenderize straight men in a way that all straight men who are really the victims of this toxic masculinity in our culture, we offer them ways to become human by our mere presence and watching us be ourselves, interact with each other, touch each other. And they may be horrified by at first. Women have been having this dialogue, the contemporary dialogue, for close to 50 years now. And women as a group, I would just say, are much hipper to the issues and to how they get solved. Straight men they're on an island. We can look at our recent election and see the percentages that buy into this toxicity. I have many, many close straight male friends, and they have all said to me over the course of the last 43 years, what a difference it has made in their life. And this is not a credit to me. I just happen to be a gay human being, to be around me and my friends because it has taught them so much. I'm not a teacher of them, I'm their friend. Mm-hmm. But our presence in the world, to me, it's a healing presence. And in our culture, that particularly means healing the toxicity that patriarchy forces on gay boys, straight boys, forces on them and puts them into a mold that you see it. You can go to a third grade soccer game and you can pick out the straight boys from the gay boys already. So I think our healing presence, much like, and I say this with a little trepidation, but the presence of Black people for me is a healing presence in the world. And part of that is because of the life they have had to create out of whole cloth, having had no advantage. And the place they come to as human beings is to say, be alive. You be alive. Do you know how short this is? Be alive. Do whatever you have to do to be alive. To me, that's what gay people also do. I saw that in that Stations of the Cross. I just thought there are all these vibrant women and men from marginalized communities thriving, vibrating. I was getting the vibe out here and I'm 3,000 miles away. It was like, I need that. So I appreciate the question a lot. And
Oh, thank you. Let's talk about queer saints. In our tradition as Catholics, we have these figures. As a kid, I remember them being explained or as like spiritual superheroes. They're role models for us. Role models in holiness, role models in virtue. They're special people in whom something of what the divine offers becomes real, becomes embodied, becomes present in this world, in an actual person, with their quirks, with their wounds and scars and all that's distinctive about them. And I have to also say that, I part of what brings this question up, Mark Jordan was an important person for me in entering into the world of queer theology. And as a moral theologian, he put forward this idea from the Catholic tradition that before we can have a queer theology, we need queer saints to embody that grace before we can do this discursive stuff that scholarly folks like us, we writing and making sense of it through our fancy words and sentences and our paragraphs, and we need queer saints. So what's the question? My question for you is something about what is your own sense of the presence of queer saints in the world, the need for queer saints in the world, maybe the ministry or the mission of those queer saints who are out there.
When I took my first vows as a Jesuit, we were asked to take a name of a saint as our vow name. This is 1972. There were 12 of us in my vow class, and people take names like Ignatius or Francis Xavier or Peter Claver. And I took the name Magdalene. And we don't say our name until we take our vows. And we're on the altar at the college church at St. Thomas University, by the way. And I say, William Magdalene Glenn. And the crowd's like, Magdalene, boys don't take girls' names. Magdalene was my queer saint. I understood her as a person who was in the tradition, wrestling with her sexuality and her love for God in the person of Jesus. Now that's apocryphal in large part, but she's symbolic. It was very important for me. When I encountered Harvey Milk, who's now kind of in the mist, he's like, oh, who was that? Harvey Milk was a Jew. He was joyful. He was a joyful human being. And he, of course, said coming out is the secret to the end of all of this. But he pulled me out of the closet in one of his last speeches before he was killed by inviting me into a community that I didn't know I needed to be part of. And to me, that was a holy act. So Harvey Milk, for me, I went to his funeral at Temple Emmanuel, and his casket was covered with hundreds of pounds of chrysanthemums, and we were asked to go. So I blessed his casket, and I took a chrysanthemum off it, which I still have 43 years later in a little sacred vial. But that's my relic from that saint, is Harvey Milk, because he changed people's lives by being in love with them.
It's an interesting question, Dominic, when you sent this question to us about thinking about, queer saints. And one of the first things that came to my mind is how just to be a spiritual person of some authenticity queer or not, is a deeply countercultural reality, right? Our world is not designed for this kind of thing. And I don't mean that spirituality should negate the world, but it does push against certain values in the world. So there's something deeply countercultural about just having a spiritual life.
Mm-hmm.
And when you add to that the ways in which the saints lived very non-normative lives and pushed against normativities for their time. I mean, celibacy is a deeply queer reality in the sense that it's pushing against particular normativities. And
spiritual or sexual practice and spiritual practice.
Yes. And so just the reality of some of the spiritual lives, which push against the normativities of culture that can be life-killing. That in and of itself is an important function of the saints, that they live particular lives of non-normativity within structures, and they're able to push against them and help the institution live to its best self. And in terms of particular ones, I mean, I go back to John McNeill, who, I would also say Janine Gramick, who are two folks who really just pushed back and paid the price. And that is an important lesson, that it's not all nicey nice.
You said that, Kathy. I wrote down today, to be a saint is to be queer.
Yeah, I think in a certain way,
Mm-hmm.
anyone who is considered saintly
so against
is non-normative and pushes against the normativities in particular kinds of ways.
Mm-hmm.
When they pulled Michael Judge's body out of the first tower after 9/11, and there was that iconic photograph of him being held by the firemen, and the people rose up and declared him a saint. I think key to that was the fact he was known to be gay, and that he had ministered in dignity and ministered with men with delight in dignity, that he was a man trying to grapple with sexuality. There was something, to me, subconscious in the culture, that when he was proclaimed a saint, and that doesn't happen much in our lives, where there's just it happened a lot in the old days. This man was proclaimed a saint. I thought intuitively, New York knew that his homosexuality was a critical piece of his sanctity.
Right.
And there's something there, I can't totally unravel that. I'm not an academic, but there's something there was very powerful for me, that was constituent to his holiness for people who didn't even know that fully, but he was a gay man struggling. So.
I feel like we could have this conversation for many weeks, very enjoyably and graciously and gracefully. I want to just open a little space, recognizing again that you two are just meeting today, although I count you as dear friends of mine. What questions would you like to ask each other in the last minutes of our time together today?
I have two already for you, Kathy.
Okay.
One is a fact question, the other's a thought question.
Okay.
Was Mary Daly a professor of yours at BC?
No.
Was she already gone? Was she retired?
She was basically not teaching at that time.
When you spoke, she was so present to me. When I was in theology, Mary Daly's name was about as evocative a name as anyone could be in American theology. And at the Jesuit school, it was like there were Mary Daly advocates and people scared to living death of Mary Daly's intellect. It's like, oh my God.
And
so
I just mentioned for the people who don't know who Mary Daly is, she became sort of a post-Catholic lesbian theologian who had tenure at Boston College, but then wouldn't allow men in her classroom and was pushed out of the university after some legal struggles, et cetera. What more would you add to that? I was an undergraduate at Boston College and heard these stories, and then a theology student there later in my life. But for those who don't know her, what else would you add just to texture that account? Either of you.
Well, I would just say that she was one of the first to really speak that kind of truth. And at the time she was speaking in the 60s and early 70s, there was a lot of feminist separatism happening. And I don't know how things have changed or not for her, but she's since passed. But it was the challenge of being the first is never easy. And she was certainly one of the first, if not the first.
For me, she billed the cat for the Society of Jesus. She put the bag around the Jesuits' head and said, you boys have got to start paying attention. This is the real world. And I'm speaking about a world that you are going to be required to enter into and inhabit and help correct. And her bravery, and her style was what it was, but her bravery was, as my niece would say, ginormous. It was just,
yeah,
it was breathtaking and scary because she was as clear as it gets.
Yeah.
So can I ask my other question of you?
Sure.
I'm interested in, I've been very affected by feminist theology and by my women friends, many of whom were Catholic, some of whom are. But I'm curious how you thread the needle being a woman, more than a gay person, a woman in the Roman Church. How you balance the structural misogyny that's at the heart of the church, or more the structural patriarchy that is blind to so many issues, including our issues, to use the course term issues. And yet you are an observant and faithful Catholic, which I admire very much, but I'm interested how you do it, if you get my sense of how you do it, what I'm asking you.
Well, what I hear you saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, what I hear you saying is, how do you actually make that work? It's fine as an intellectual idea, but how does that work?
How does that work?
Yeah, and that's a fair question. And the fact of the matter is that it doesn't always work. And that's part of what I meant about the dance that happens. Part of how it works for me is I find religious communities where I can negotiate that more easily. There are some particular communities where I say, I cannot go there. And there are others where I say, this is going to be present, but there's a lot of like-minded people here, and leaders are making space in certain ways for this, and I can function in that. So I think for me, it's also this sense of, I don't know, maybe that's the part of me that's Italian American Catholic, this sense of, wait a minute, this is my family too.
I admire that.
Come on, this is my family too. I have a right to be here. So that's part of what I meant, that it's hard to take that stance if you're not also taking the stance of a kind of faithful dissent. Because if you go just kind of saying, well, I'm just going to put up with it, I mean, that's not life-giving, and that's not what God wants, I don't think. So for me, it's making sure that I can be in places where I can thrive in some way. And that's part of my interest in study, is figuring out how to understand the tradition so I can figure out how to push back at it or what to accept about it, and have a more intellectually engaged conversation about it. But also just kind of, I think the other thing for me is understanding the way in which it takes a long time for communities to move. If you want to really be inclusive and move together, It takes a long time. If you're in communion with people and you want the community to move, it takes a long time. So I do feel I have a certain perspective about it, that it's gonna take a lot of time. And as long as I can keep doing the work of pushing and participating, and more importantly, feeling like when I have to pull back, I pull back. I can't, if I can't handle it, I have to pull back. That dance is part of how I manage it.
I very much appreciate your answer, especially the last few paragraphs. And I'm curious, could I get an infusion of Italian Catholic in me? Can I open my arms to that? Just let me know when you find out, okay?
Well, my question to you, Bill, is, maybe the opposite of that, which is you mentioned about your need to leave the Catholic Church and your struggle, and particularly around, some of the HIV/AIDS work you're doing, which is completely, I get it. It's very problematic. But as you look back, what were resources from the tradition that sustained you during that, even though you weren't able to kind of engage in particular kinds of practices? You said you were deeply formed in this, between your Jesuit training and so, were there things that were part of your DNA that you were able to bring into that context?
So we're going to go for another hour, Dominic, for that answer. Okay. Take notes, somebody. I had a Jesuit spiritual director almost my whole life. I make 8-day Ignatian retreats every year for 40 years since I left the Jesuits. I have a daily practice incorporating some Eastern as well as Roman Catholic traditions. I'm very faithful to it. Thomas Merton has been my companion, as close as a brother to me my whole life, and continues to be. My cohort of closest friends include many Jesuits and ex-Jesuits, and I feel deeply a part of the culture. While I have found it very difficult to venture into a church and find what I experience so alienating. I go into San Francisco, which is about an hour and 10 minutes away from Mass. So that's like a half-day trip for me, down, staying back. I don't go every week. I've only been doing that for the past couple of years because my hunger for it is still alive. I've worshiped with the Episcopalians for 30 years. They are wonderful people. Their liturgy is indistinguishable. And yet, it is not in my core. And many of my ex-Jesuit friends are Episcopal priests. That's probably true in New York as well. I mean, a lot of the best parishes here are Jesuit parishes, but so I'm a Catholic in so many ways, but it's so profoundly different than the church I was raised in and that got in my blood. So I appreciate your question. It's a complicated question.
Yeah.
It's an angsty question for me. I get angst hearing. It's like, oh, Kathy, should we go there? Is that really what we're going to do? But we did. I'm sorry about my phone if it's driving Dominic.
Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you for answering that. I appreciate it. I'm sorry that it created angst, but thank you.
I live with angst. I'm Irish. What do you please. I breathe. I'm angsty.
Well, I hope the feast day of dear St. Patrick yesterday brought you some relief from your Irish angst, Bill.
It intensified it, Dominic, really, please.
Well, I'm very grateful for this conversation. A pot of gold under the rainbow, that sign of hope. Thank you both for agreeing to be part of this and opening up so much of your wisdom and your life experience to this conversation. Before we end it, Any last words, maybe to reflect on what this experience has been like a little bit, or anything else you'd like to share to bring this to completion?
Well, Dominic, I'm thinking about this, your whole project is about flourishing and leadership. And I think we can only flourish and lead better when we bring all of ourselves into our work, when we can bring our spiritual energies with our intellectual energies and our professional energies and commitments. I think we can be better leaders when we pull all those pieces together, and we can help ourselves flourish and the institution flourish.
Yes.
I'm involved in conversations like this from time to time, and Dominic, and of course I've told you this before, but you bring a special gift to the way you hold this space. You both ask critically interesting and wise questions, but you also invite us, you relax us. I think it's true for both of us. I can only really speak for myself, but I've experienced both Kathy and me in this dialogue or trialogue as being, we're here, kind of as we are, and that doesn't always happen. In fact, we all know often that doesn't happen. So I want to acknowledge your style and your leadership, and to say, Kathy, the next time I'm in New York visiting Dominic, let's have a meal together. And
Absolutely, I would love that. And I agree, Dominic, you've created a great space for us. I wasn't sure how this was going to work. So.
I wasn't either. But
it was grace-filled.
It was. Well, thank you both for contributing to flourishing.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
See you next time on this journey.
Yes.